And so what does all that have to do with net zero? So just to make sure we're on the same page, net zero, as defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, is when a balance is achieved between human-caused greenhouse gas emissions and their removal from the atmosphere over a specified period with defined boundaries, which involves reducing emissions to as close to zero as possible and then offsetting any remaining unavoidable emissions. And typically, net zero is applied to maybe a country or a corporation or another organization, and that's what sets the boundaries. And that organization or country will then measure their own greenhouse gas emissions. They'll put in place measures to drive those down, and in the meantime, they will offset unavoidable emissions by investing in carbon removal from outside of their supply chain. So if you're a business, say a law firm, for example, you can offset your emissions by investing in the planting of trees in another part of the country, and that's outside of your supply chain. So that leads us on to the two core uses of carbon credits for net zero. The first is as a policy tool by governments. So the EU emissions trading scheme, also known as EU ETS, was the very first cap and trade emissions trading scheme. It started back in 2005. And what this did is it gave in-scope businesses, which were typically very polluting industries like refineries, steel mills, cement factories, an allowance of how much carbon they were allowed to emit. And this was based off the best available technology at the time. And over time, these allowances have gone down. And any organization that was using that was emitting less carbon than its allowance, was able to bank the credits. So say a cement factory had an allowance of 1,000 tons of CO2 a year and they only emitted 900, they could then have these 100 credits, which they could then sell. So that's the cap part of the system, is that limit on their emissions, and then the trade part is that they're then able to sell this. And so in another cement plant, for example, might have emissions of 1,005, and so they would buy 5 of these allowances from the cement factory that came under the limits. So cap and trade is the most common use of carbon credits in policy. There are 35 systems around the world, and about 20% of global emissions are within these schemes. And the reason that governments introduce these schemes is to create a financial incentive for companies to reduce their emissions. Other policy tools that use carbon credits are carbon taxes. So Singapore, for example, has a system where businesses that emit over a certain amount must pay an additional tax, but they can offset some of their emissions by using credits from schemes that the Singaporean government has approved, and that will reduce their tax burden. And then another policy tool is fuel mandates. So in the UK, you'll notice when you go to fill up your petrol, there's E10 fuel, and that means it's ethanol 10, which is a blend of petrol that contains low carbon ethanol, usually from biosources, to reduce the overall carbon emissions of the petrol. And that's because there's a fuel mandate on the fuel suppliers to do so. So there are 3 common policy tools that use carbon credits to drive down emissions. And so to illustrate this is an example business case. So our fictional company, Harbour Company, emits 50,000 tons a year of carbon dioxide equivalent from refueling ships. I say carbon dioxide equivalent because most of that will be volatile organic compounds, which is what makes petrol stations smell. So when you're tipping fuel into a tank, some of that fuel will evaporate into the atmosphere. And this, because it tends to be those more greenhouse gas, higher greenhouse gas potential molecules, actually has more of an impact than straight emissions of CO2. And so this company is emitting 50,000 tons a year CO2 equivalent, and they are in a cap and trade market where the average carbon price is £80 a ton. And so if they want to solve this problem by buying carbon allowances, they're going to have to spend 4 million a year on carbon allowances into the future. But alternatively, they could invest into a vapor recovery system at a cost of 5 million. And so just doing a straight payback period, investment period, that's 1.56 years. And that suddenly makes this investment in this volatile organic carbon capture system very financially attractive. Whereas without that financial penalty from the carbon allowances, there's no financial incentive for this company to invest that £5 million. And so that's why these are very powerful policy tools for governments to use, because they create a financial incentive for organizations in their jurisdictions to invest in the latest technologies to reduce their emissions. And then from a corporate perspective, the way that carbon credits feature is that corporations can use carbon credits to meet their net zero obligations. So many organizations around the world, for example, Sky, have made public statements that they will be, and the BBC, that they will be net zero by a certain year. And part of that net zero journey is driving down their own emissions. But there, in many cases, there will be emissions that they just don't know how to drive down. And so they'll buy carbon credits to cancel those out. And when we look, and these are typically voluntary carbon markets. And when we look at 2024, the biggest buyers of voluntary carbon credits were actually Shell and Microsoft. And what I find very interesting is that Shell paid on average just over $4 for a carbon credit. And that's because these were the REDD plus credits that we discussed earlier. So they're typically the cheapest. They're about preventing deforestation, typically in countries like Brazil. And so Shell really went in for a quantity bet, whereas Microsoft paid a much, much higher price on average, $189 a credit. And that's because they were focusing on the development of new carbon capture technologies. So most of Microsoft's investments were into things like direct air capture, which are at the pricier end of the scale. And so this is something that corporations need to think about when they're defining a carbon offsetting strategy is what is the story we're trying to tell? Is it we're trying to balance our emissions and therefore we need to just focus on getting the most carbon credits for our budget? Or is it we're promoting the development of new technologies? And it's quite a complicated communications decision.